We're diving today into AI in compliance, smarter, safer systems, what's working, what's next. With me are Ray Richardson and Victor Matafonov, a regular on the podcast now. And we're going to talk about everything AI in compliance. So maybe to kick off, actually, let's start on a personal note. Victor, why did you start working in compliance? And you've lasted this long. What's sort of kept you in the game?
Well, I can say that I didn't have any childhood ambitions of being a compliance officer, but I have been a banker for a long time, and I've been a banker in the risk audit and compliance area. And I think when I first came across compliance at ANZ in London, there was one compliance officer for the whole of the region. And It's just grown massively ever since. So I guess I sort of was there at the beginning of the sort of compliance sort of revolution. And I think a lot of it kicked off after September 11, particularly with the sanctions side of things.
Okay, cool. Ray, what about you? AI, obviously, super hot topic. You were there before it was the case, right? Data, ML. So what sort of pulled you into that?
Yeah, well, actually, my journey started, nearly 30 years ago, So I did a postgrad, a PhD in AI when AI actually wasn't around, so to speak, And what was really interesting at the time was that, a lot of the techniques, the algorithms, the general methodologies largely stays the same. What's changed in the last 20, 25 years is compute power, basically, and the availability of data, okay? And that's made a lot of what I was playing with, let's say, back in the early 90s, now actually prime time. And it's, for me, it's been a long wait. And I have to say it is the golden age, for AI. Really looking forward to, making many more applications. Yeah.
Awesome. And so when we were preparing for this podcast, right, the number of use cases that you're working on across the bank, but compliance was sort of the first one that you wanted to talk about. Why is that the case?
Well, because it's a really interesting space, actually, and you can really use, advanced techniques in compliance, anything to do with anti-financial crime, basically, because it's competitive, it's very dynamic. The patterns of financial crime change very, very regularly. So that dynamism, is very much suited to advanced technologies. It's suited to AI. And it's also, it's our longest use case, okay? So it's probably our largest, most in-depth, longest running, and it continues to evolve. So that was the one that made sense for me to talk about.
Yeah. Awesome, thank you. And Victor, so you talked to us a little bit about yesterday, this perfect storm in compliance. So I guess when Ray knocked on your door and said, I think we could do something together, you were ready to embrace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if I look back on the last 5 years, right, we've seen three sort of significant changes within the industry and within the bank. I mean, first of all, there's been an unprecedented amount of regulatory change. A lot of that was across the industry, but also particularly in the UAE associated with the FATF review, the subsequent grey listing, etc. So a whole lot of new regulations were put in place, and probably the most difficult one was in the transaction monitoring space, where we had to move from a model where we had to investigate alerts and file SARs within 90 days. That was kind of like the industry norm across the globe, really. And this was changed to 35 working days. So that was a significant increase in the resources that we required. So regulatory changes was probably the first one, and we really didn't have much time to make the changes. So we often ended up just throwing people at the problem to resolve it, and sort of said, at some future point in time, we'll come back and try and make it more efficient. Secondly, we've actually had a significant increase in transactions in Emirates MBD, something like 35% on average transaction growth over the last 5 years, which is a good problem to have, but it also means that I've got lots more alerts that my team have to investigate, costs are higher, and of course, you know, we have to find ways of accommodating that. And I think the third one, particularly in more recent years, has just been cost control. You know, the banking industry in the UAE is going through a cost control stage. Interest rates are falling. Corporate taxes have been introduced initially at 9% and now 15% this year. So there's a tight cost constraint for us. And I think all these three things come together for us to basically say we've got to find ways of doing this cheaper. And that's really how Ray and compliance came together to look at ways of reducing our costs.
Awesome. And so, over to you, Ray. What problems did you aim to solve, right? Did you come with the technology first? Did you look at the problem first? Did you already have a sort of a handle of what the problem might look like?
Well, I had an idea, in terms of what the problem might be. And the question of, is it technology first or problem first? It's problem first, always, And if you boil this down, it's a problem of inefficiency, essentially, So, the traditional transaction monitoring systems, the rule-based ones that every bank has, and will continue to have, they're basically very conservative. So they're designed to capture anything that's remotely suspicious, which is great from a coverage perspective. But what it means is that literally 90, sometimes 95% of the alerts coming out of these systems are false positives. And as Victor said, this creates challenges. And, the primary challenge is from the investigation teams, basically trying for them to keep up, basically, especially in a situation like ENBD, where business is growing, transaction volumes are growing, it's hard to keep up. And the second problem then, of course, is that the genuinely suspicious transactions, it takes time to get to them, and that's never a good thing. So if you've got the time between an alert being generated and a SAR being filed is over 90 days, that's a real problem. It's a problem for customers. It's a problem for the bank, basically. So for us, we were looking at this. Now, the obvious thing, in terms of if you're looking at this, you might say, look, geez, we'll replace the transaction monitoring system, the rule-based one. We can come up with something much, much better. And you talk to the data scientists in the team, and they're saying, geez, I can do so much better than that. But the realization has to be that this is tried and trusted. It's well understood. It's very effective at finding suspicious activity. It's not efficient, but it's effective. Okay, and more importantly, the regulators understand it. They accept it. We ourselves have a whole control framework built around it. So replacing it is a very difficult thing to do, and actually the wrong thing to do. So again, what we're looking at here is how can we augment it? Can we use machine learning, AI, to make it more efficient? And that's essentially exactly what we did. So we built machine learning models that sat outside of the existing transaction monitoring system. They took the output and they made decisions in terms of what's the most suspicious. And by the simple rank ordering of the alerts helps us to drive a very efficient setup. And that was a problem, and that was the basis of the solution. Yeah.
How long did it take from problem identification to sort of delivering that impact?
So compliance is an important space. So
Yes.
The coverage, precision are important, basically. So getting it wrong makes a difference. So building the models took longer than it does in other parts of the organization, where the consequence of getting it wrong aren't as high. Okay. Now, having said that, if you look at the journey, in the building of the models and the back testing of the models and getting them right, it was probably the quickest part of the journey. The longest part of the journey, as is always the case, is implementing it within the business, basically. So, the change management process that comes with rolling out what is a significant change to a well-established way of working, basically. And that took the longest. And that was something that we had to do very, let's say, very carefully and very intentionally, basically, because you've got to primarily build trust within your business partners. If they don't trust it, you're lost. They won't use it, and it will fail, basically, no matter how good it is.
And how was that, Victor, for you, this journey, right? Did you have any concerns in terms of adopting this technology? Did you have sort of a stage gate approach? How did you ensure the transparency, and was there any communication on the regulatory front, or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those points were important. I think from a regulatory perspective, regulators don't like black boxes. They like for you to be able to explain what the system's doing. Auditors and regulators are often skeptical. They think that you're trying to find a cheap way of getting out of all this work. So you had to go through all of those processes. But I think in the end, I'm quite pleased as to where we got to, and actually we didn't really sort of eliminate any sort of significant risks or costs. What we ended up doing was prioritizing the alerts into high, medium, and low. And what it meant with the high risk alerts was that we were able to escalate them straight to a level 2, a senior experienced person who can action it quickly. And then for the low risk alerts, we hibernated them and said, okay, let's just wait and see if there's any further activity that would actually happen on that. But of course, all of this, we had to consider, how do we explain this? One of the new regulations that was introduced is model validation. So we also had to go through model validation processes. And I think that helps our auditors and regulators understand that there is a process behind it. It's actually been reviewed and checked, and it makes sense, and it doesn't significantly increase the risk for the bank.
Got you. And it sounds like a very ripe space for innovation compliance, right? Because you've worked with Silent 8, we've done things internally.
Yeah.
We're looking even, more longer term with global sanctions screening. I'm guessing this is all deliberate, and how would you say all of this comes together in terms of a strategy for compliance?
Yeah, well, I think if we look at compliance, probably the largest cost of compliance is people. And something like 70% of the compliance team are doing operational jobs, investigating alerts. And I think, as Ray has mentioned, in many of these cases, more than 90% of the cases, the alerts are false alerts, right? So, we've got a lot of people looking at things which ultimately end up being false alerts, that, payments are not stopped, customers are not sort of turned away or exited, and SARs are not filed, right? It's only for a very small percentage that we end up taking those appropriate actions. So absolutely, this is an area that is ripe. The more that we can reduce that 70% of operational staff doing these kinds of things, the absolute better.
That makes sense. And kind of linking what you both said, how has the response been from these senior investigators to sort of this new AI approach? You said you had to be very sort of deliberate and meticulous in the approach. How has it been received so far, and what was the strategy there?
Yeah, well, I suppose, as I said, you're introducing a machine into the alert prioritization process, basically, into a business process that was fully controlled by humans, the investigator teams and the control teams. So the biggest concern, initially is hibernation. What happens if there's actually a SAR in the hibernated alerts? So, straight away what we said, okay, we'll set the hibernation threshold at 5%. Remember, we think 90%, a lot of the time, 90% of the alerts are false positive. We set it at 5%, very, very low, okay? And then it was, a slow rollout, basically, moving it up percent by percent, getting it over 40% over many months, basically. And each time you're doing this, what you're doing is you're consistently or continuously, evaluating the deprioritized alerts. Are there any SARs in there, okay? And just making sure that the model is operating safely. And this, I suppose, measured approach to rolling out the system, and the big set of evidences you build up as you do this slow rollout, basically, it builds confidence, and trust. And once you've got trust, you get, you get adoption. So in terms of how it's been accepted, what happens over time is that the investigators realize that actually, with this system in place, a lot of the low value alerts, the false positive ones, are being removed. And actually, they think then, or no, they see that, their time is being used more effectively, their skills are being used more effectively. They're able to actually, focus their attention on the suspicious alerts and build high quality cases, basically. And that's what, these are skilled people, that's what they're there for. This idea of repetitively going over, alerts that maybe have been, they happen every month, basically, because the rule just fires every month, and that alert comes up again, and they have to, not slavishly, but the playbook is you process that alert according to these, and it takes a lot of their time. So that's, I think that's been a big element of the acceptance and adoption. But it's taken time, and you don't rush these things out. You certainly don't rush them out in an area like compliance or risk, where there's a lot of regulatory oversight. And that's exactly the way we've taken it. Yeah,
that's awesome. Have you had that experience as well on your side, Victor, on the other side of the
Yeah,
table?
well, absolutely. I mean, I think I've got sort of two camps in my department. I've got the risk stewards who are sort of saying, okay, is this being done safely, etc. But then, of course, we've got the users, the people who are doing the investigation. And I think for the investigators, absolutely. I mean, investigating thousands and thousands of alerts can get repetitive, it can get boring, and the more that we can eliminate that sort of repetitive work and focus on the really interesting stuff, the better for them, right? And I think that's a better outcome for our investigators as well.
Awesome.
I think actually one of the things that's important as well is because we've mentioned this notion of black box, basically. And, it's true to say machine learning models originally were black box models, but, the world has moved on a great deal in that respect. So, explainability, interpretable machine learning, the techniques have really developed. They're the types of things that have developed over the last number of years. Now there's these open source libraries that help you with interpretability. And one of the things that is really important around explaining AML models is that you need to work with the investigators, so you don't want simple, explanations. You want detailed explanations. You want the explanations to be in the language of compliance, basically. So it's saying, look, we're ranking this alert at this level because we can see a particular layering or a structured AML typology, basically. And an investigator is looking at that saying, yeah, actually, that's fantastic. The only reason that the model can say that is that it's been working alongside the investigators over time, and you've got this feedback loop, basically. So it's an iterative process, because, again, the models themselves are not intelligent at the outset. They become more intelligent through use, basically. And the explainability modules in particular, they rely initially on the expert validators to say, or investigators to say, this is the reason, basically. So, again, this co-creation of these solutions helps with acceptance too.
Yeah, this machine-human symbiosis is what delivers the business impact. And it's amazing that you've delivered sort of a quick win, right, in this space. Of course, I'm going to have to mention the buzzword Gen AI. All of these new technologies that you're referring to. How are you approaching, the future use cases? What are the next use cases in compliance? What are the next problems to be tackled? And are some of these new technologies bringing, new solutions around explainability, for example? What's the plan there?
Yeah, well, I think we actually have one use case that we're currently working on in relation to the filing of SARS, so suspicious activity reports. And I think if we look at it, the average SAR, the information that we actually have to provide to the regulators is somewhere between 50 and 100 pages long. When you take into account, the KYC information, the transaction information, the statements, etc., as well as explaining what the concerns are, any sort of adverse media that we may have come across, etc. So basically, our staff are gathering quite a lot of information, and I think on average it takes about 4 hours to compile all of this information and then to sort of produce a summary. And I think
per report, per SARS,
SAR, right? And we're filing thousands of SARS per month, right?
My God.
So this is a lot of work, right? So one of the use cases we're looking at with Ray and the team at the moment is using Gen AI to summarize all this information for us to produce a SAR which makes sense, which gets to the right point, so that when the authorities read these, they can say, yes, I understand, right? They don't have to go through pages and pages of stuff to really understand what the issue or what the concern is. And when they're receiving thousands of these from banks across the whole country, they actually have to be able to be succinct and get to the point on all of these. So we're hoping that will identify some significant efficiencies for us in that space, but also improve the consistency of the SARs that are being filed.
That's awesome. And Ray, how do you know, because you use ML and sort of traditional advanced analytic strategies for some problems, for other problems you're using these new tools. How do you know, or how do you choose which tool for which problem?
Well, Yeah, Gen AI, we've got to understand is it's phenomenal. It really is. But it's really powerful in initial use cases around role augmentation, where it's document centric. There's high frequency, high volumes, and when it's dealing with documents and unstructured data. Okay. Traditional AI is really, really good when it's dealing with very large volumes of structured data and looking for patterns, okay? Now, of course, they're both entirely complementary and we use both together. And, there's going to be a very long journey, in this roadmap. So, we haven't finished what we're doing in traditional AI with compliance at all. We've started a piece of work right now. Actually, there's several fronts opening up right now. There's one front whereby we've built a customer risk score model. And this is trained on the entire customer population, not just the customers that have received an alert from the transaction monitoring system. And what this allows us to do actually is identify potential suspicious activity outside of what the existing transaction monitoring system can see. Okay, so that's one example. We've got another piece of work that's looking at assisted decision making. So, for instance, one of the things that we see is that in the overall process, as you're investigating cases, there may be a requirement to raise a request for information, reach out to a customer. Okay, now this is challenging because it takes time and it actually creates friction with customers, particularly if it's unnecessary. So one of the things we have now is this model that's going to look at this and say, actually, is it worthwhile raising an RFI? Because in some cases, there's enough information. It's not going to change the outcome. We're going to raise a SAR. In fact, going with the RFI actually delays the filing of the SAR. It's not going to change anything. It's kind of a defensive move. In other situations, actually, we have that information. It's just not readily available. It's in our KYC documentation, or it's in old case files, basically. And Gen AI is fantastic at bringing that out. We have a piece of work that's looking at, because again, we're not going to be dispensing with the traditional rule-based transaction monitoring system. It's going to stay for quite some time. One of the problems with that right now is the thresholds that are set for every rule are very static. Okay. And there's no reason why we can't use an optimization AI model to look at this and say, let's dynamically set the thresholds. So in fact, actually, in real time, in response to, let's say, changing patterns in transaction flows or maybe changes in regulation, the AI model goes in and says, okay, we're going to bring that threshold up, bring this threshold down, and this will create a very, let's say, agile and responsive control layer, basically. And combining that then with the existing models, which triage the alerts that are coming out, you end up getting a very effective, because you want, your compliance needs to be layered, multiple lines of defense. And this is all heading towards what we're going to eventually have, which is agentic AI, basically. You'll have agents that will have roles, basically, which my job is to look at the alerts coming out. My job is to set the thresholds. My job is to assist the decisioning around whether we raise an RFI or not. I think what's really, really important in all of this is, though, it's human in the loop. The human is always going to be there, okay? And the ultimate decision in terms of whether to, raise a SAR, whether to close a case, it's always going to be with the human. And what we're doing here is just making it much more effective and efficient.
Yeah, so it's chipping away at the existing workflow,
it is.
Putting in sort of these different technologies.
Making it much more efficient and actually targeting the skills that we've built up over many, many years within our intelligence teams, basically, that they focus on the really knotty problems and say, I know what this is, and they're able to get to it and analyze it and come up with what the right solution is, basically.
And actually that makes me think, Victor, like you're going to have to give your staff new skills, right, in this brave new world of agentic AI, or as you chip away at these workflows, they'll have to be able to have oversight, control, understand how the technology is doing these things. So actually there's a whole sort of training piece, upskilling around AI and compliance as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really a move away from sort of laborious, repetitive processes that people follow to actually, intelligent understanding of the financial crime risks and being able to sort of make decisions based on that. From my staff, I often get a few questions about Gen AI, and I actually think, and of course there's some concerns. Does this mean I'll lose a job, etc.? But I think I always go back to them and say there's probably two roles in this sort of brave new world that will always be safe. And I think one is the creative ideas that come out. The systems are never going to come up with ideas. Humans are going to be the ones that will come up with the ideas of, I think we can use technology here, or I think we can use it there. And then secondly, the final checking and decision making, right? I think we've all used ChatGPT, right? And it's produced something that's been wonderfully written, but then there's some pretty strong factual inaccuracies in there, right? So I always tell my guys that, there'll always be a job for checkers and people who make the final ultimate decision. So, and I think that's only improving and enriching our employees' experience rather than sort of diminishing it.
Absolutely. This has been an awesome conversation, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Maybe to leave our audience on one thought, if you had to pick the biggest use case in compliance with AI, with these new tools, the step change sort of outcomes, which one would it be? Which piece of the puzzle would you pick today?
I think probably the most impactful one would have been the transaction monitoring alert scoring. I think for us, it saved something like 70 people through that process by, escalating the high-risk alerts and hibernating the others. So that's been the most impactful for us.
So that was a home run straight off the
Absolutely.
get-go. Ray, what about you?
Well, I agree with Victor because, again, all of the efficiency you drive are based on the volume of alerts that are coming through the system, basically. So if you can at the front of the system basically reduce the number of alerts so that actually you're looking at a much smaller percentage of alerts, that's the biggest impact you can have. Okay, no doubt. I think coming after that, it's going to be Gen AI. It's going to be initially these augmentation use cases, so that, and this won't happen dramatically quickly, basically. So we'll be looking at existing systems in role, augmenting those roles, and then slowly introducing agentic AI, basically. So I can very clearly see the path that we're going to go on here, and it's going to make a dramatic difference. It really is. And I think, as Victor said, for the people on the ground, I think it's going to make, like you asked Victor why he started in compliance. I think a lot of people working compliance didn't want to be there to slavishly go through playbooks, and they wanted to do this to fight financial crime, basically, and this will focus their efforts so on a daily basis they're actually seeing real financial crime every single day, whereas nowadays with 90% of the alerts being false positive, they see it maybe once a month, basically, because everything else is false, basically, and this is a good thing.
Well, you've both painted a fantastic picture of AI and compliance. I think it's an exciting space to be in. I'm sure we'll get loads of applications now for your team, Ray. I want to join. I want to look at these problems. Thank you so much for the conversation today.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.